that. Can't see much up through here. I hear the brush popping and stuff. Oh, there he goes. Jesus. Get up here where I can see him real quick. Get up here. Get a better picture. Oh, God. Man. Oh. Oh, God. 2 of them.
As much of the mad and macabre as they were to see that day. Became a nightmare. I'm gonna do a walkthrough. Over 1,300 pieces of evidence were collected from the crime scene.
Scratch marks along the wall.
There was no doubt something paranormal was going on.
And for that exact reason, I'll continue my research to drive away the darkness.
Thanks for tuning in to ASAP Radio. My name is Ben Robison.
And I'm Nicole Katsanis.
So, I'm just going to jump right out there. I mean, normally I'd say, hey, how are you doing and all that stuff, but I know how you're doing.
Yeah, I don't matter right now.
You do.
Tell them what matters right now.
Jeff Meldrum.
Yes,
Jeff Meldrum is just, I'm so excited about this episode just because I'm a big believer in Sasquatch or Bigfoot or Yeti, whatever you want to call him, wild man, you name it, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
This guy, he is like top dog to me. You know, I don't know what everybody else thinks, but he's top dog to me, and he's very well known across the world. He's just, I mean, I'm a little bit, starstruck already, and I haven't even got a chance to talk to him.
All our listeners know you are like a kid in a candy store. You're a giddy little school kid, like waiting to open Christmas gifts. It is ridiculous how excited you are.
I am. When I got that opportunity, and confirmation from him via Facebook, and then when we were exchanging emails, that he was going to be on the show, I was beyond giddy. I think I did a jig even.
I think you've done a couple jigs.
Probably. So just to kind of give a little bit of a bio background to folks, do you want to read to them, what we know about
Yeah,
Jeff?
Well, we know quite a bit, but I will read what, our little thing we put together.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we are going to have Mr. Jeff Meldrum. He is a professor at Idaho State University, an anthropologist, an author, and a world-renowned Sasquatch researcher.
Yeah, buddy.
He's garnered media attention for his research as well as for traveling to Siberia to investigate the Russian wildman. And he has a collection of over 200 plaster casts of what he claims are actual Bigfoot footprints. That's pretty impressive.
It is really impressive. For one man, mind you.
Right. So not only has he received respect from people like Jane Goodall, but also from skeptics like Brian Dunning, who says, the work of responsible scientists like Dr. Meldrum is exactly what true skeptics should be asking the Bigfoot community for, not criticizing him for it.
See, and
that's
that
pretty
right
cool.
there, that is huge.
Mm-hmm.
When you start getting nods from your skeptics,
mm-hmm.
That says something. And
does.
That's rare when you ever hear that. So that's just another reason why I love this guy. Yes,
right.
I'm a fanboy. I mean,
good on the skeptic too for being able to, put the armor down a little bit and give kudos where kudos are due. But it just shows how influential his work actually is and how legit he is in what he's doing.
I agree very much. So outside of that, because we're going to have plenty of time to chat with him, which, I swear, I wish I could just sit down with this guy and have a beer and exchange my stories with his, which I know his are going to be a hell of a lot more than mine, but still, I really wish I could. But this is the next best thing. So
Hey, you guys would just have to figure out a play date and go, go in the forest.
If he wanted to ever hang with the likes of me. But let's see, what else have we been up to lately? I mean, we're getting ready to go to the Port Gamble Ghost Conference.
Yes, Port Gamble is coming up soon.
So we've been crunching like mad to get because as like all things, we're a day late, dollar short on some things, and some things we've just been so consumed by.
Life is hectic.
It is. Our
and
families
Halloween's
are
coming up. You got to get our costumes.
Yeah, my favorite holiday of the year.
I know. But yeah, life is, hectic. School's starting back up, and now all this stuff, it's just never ending. Never
ending is the best way to put it, because it's cyclical, and it'll happen over and over again repetitively till I die. Whatever. But I'm dying first. You have to die last.
Before you die, we have to do Port Gamble.
Yeah,
we're putting
that's true.
a class on. So everybody come out and see us. It's going to be at the end of this month, October 23rd, 24th, and 25th at the Port Gamble Theater. So everybody should come on down. It's going to be, 3 fun-filled days of classes, investigations, speakers, tours.
And if I know these people well enough, at least some of these people, I know there will be some kind of debauchery that'll take place.
Oh, yeah, there's already after parties that's planned into the itinerary.
Exactly. So I'm looking forward to seeing, friends and colleagues that I've had, as well as meeting new ones as well.
I'm looking forward to having drinks with lots of new people.
I'm hoping you get to do some karaokeing with Mr. Neil McNeil.
I would totally karaoke with Mr. Neil McNeil.
Yeah, I think you'd like that. If you want, though, I'll yodel.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to hold you to that. Everybody's listening right now. You're going to yodel. And maybe you can dance a jig while you yodel.
Can I revoke?
No, we're not cutting that one out either. That's staying in.
I guess I'm yodeling. I better start
You better practice,
practicing.
my friend.
Yeah. So, let's see. So, I'm sorry. I probably cut you off. Were you going to name off the website and everything?
Oh, yeah. So, if you want to attend and come to some of the classes and investigations in the tour, go to the website. It is portgamble.wix. It's wix.com/pt-gamble-paranormal, and that'll give you the itinerary of what's going on every day and the times, who's speaking, what they're speaking about, what tours you can sign up for, what classes you can sign up for, buy your tickets ahead of time, and all the info right there.
The who's who of what's going on.
What.
Or maybe we should say the who's who of the woo-woo.
Oh, maybe.
Oh, maybe. Man. Sometimes my corny jokes are really bad.
You're so punny.
So, let's see what else. Well, I don't know. We're probably going to start slowing ourselves down a bit as we go into the rest of the fall and start into
the... You have some things set up, though,
Yeah, definitely. But, try to give ourselves a little bit more free time during the holiday season and get that, survive that, I should say.
Yes, survive it. Get through
Surviving is the biggest piece.
With all my hair intact.
Yeah. So, well, I think without further ado, I think we should just go ahead and bring Mr. Meldrum on.
Yes,
and
let's do it.
I believe and just have faith in this conversation already without it happening that it's going to be an amazing, in-depth conversation.
I'm excited.
I am too. So stand by. We'll be right back. All right, so we've got here tonight with us somebody who I revere very, very, very much. I'm a little bit of a fanboy, if you may allow me to be. I've been following your work for many, many years, and so I'm very excited to have you on the show. And, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for the invitation.
You bet. And for the folks that are tuning in, obviously, we have Dr. Jeff Meldrum. He's a professor, anthropologist, author, and world-renowned Sasquatch researcher. So he's taken a chunk of his night out so he could sit down and chat with us, and we're very grateful for that. So I like to always start off with all my guests with kind of like their genesis. I always like to find out what was it exactly that got Jeff interested in studying Sasquatch.
Well, I hope your listeners aren't tired of hearing this story, because you're not the only one who likes to start off with that kind of a question. But I don't doubt it. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. My dad worked for Albertsons, and so we moved around a lot. I lived in Portland, Eugene, Spokane, Washington, and while in Spokane, I first heard about Sasquatch, Bigfoot. Here's a little different twist that some of your listeners might not be aware of. But when I was in, it was after I had seen the Patterson-Gimlin film, and that next year in grade school, I think it was in 6th grade, we actually did a unit on primates in our science curriculum, and we were telling, or the teacher was quizzing us on the various characteristics we had discussed previously that diagnosed the order primates. And then she asked for examples. And so, the expected examples of monkeys and apes were enumerated by the students, volunteered by the students. And then someone, thinking they would be a smart aleck, said Bigfoot. Now, thankfully, we had a teacher who was quite open-minded, quite progressive thinking, and still remember Mrs. Davis. And she said, well, let's see, what do the descriptions of Sasquatch include? And as we described or repeated these descriptions that we'd all read about over the preceding year, since the Patterson film was shown there in Spokane, we concluded that indeed it had those distinguishing characteristics and should be listed up there on the board. And then we were all asked to volunteer to select one of those to do a report on. And
that's where you came in.
As the fates would guide it, I guess you could say, I and another of my classmates were chosen to do our report on Bigfoot. And as soon as I had volunteered that, then all of a sudden I thought, oh man, where am I going to find any information about Bigfoot? Because I had actually ordered Roger's book, so I had that. I had that first membership newsletter that had the Northwest Research Association's logo, which featured prominently in our classroom presentation. We used an opaque projector to shine it on the wall, and I sketched it out very, very well, and had that for a long, long time until the paper became so old and crinkly that it literally broke apart. But my teacher said, well, go talk to your librarian. If you have a question, go talk to now you go to Google, but in those days you went and talked to your librarian. Well, lo and behold, not only did she have in her reserve section her own copy of John Green's book, On the Track of the Sasquatch, but she produced a manila file folder that was just full of magazine and newspaper clippings, magazine articles and newspaper clippings. And it was like a treasure trove. And so we dug into that and started researching this intently. Well, years later, this is where it's quite funny. Years later, I was in Harrison Hot Springs at one of the Sasquatch, what did they call it in those days? Stephen Harvey organized the... I can't remember now. It's not Sasquatch Summit. It was something like that.
Drawing a blank.
And
sure,
that was my first public presentation. But it was funny because as I came up to the receptionist desk there at the lodge, I discovered that there was no room in the inn. There had been some mistake, some miscommunication, and they were completely full, and with no room reserved for me. And in earshot stood John Green, who I immediately recognized when he came up and introduced himself. He had overheard, and he said, well, there's no problem, you're coming to stay with me. So not only did I have this opportunity to meet all these interesting people, but I actually stayed at John Green's house along with John Bindernagel. That's when I first met John Bindernagel. And as we were sitting there around after dinner, chatting and comparing stories, John asked this question: so how did you get involved in this subject? And so I told him that little story about the librarian, and he perked up in his seat and he said, Spokane, you said. What school was it? And I said, Indian Trail Elementary. And he said, do you remember the teacher's name? Well, that's been how many years? And I said, no, I'm afraid I don't. He said, did it happen to be Mary Bessaker? Now I remember it. And boom, the penny dropped, and I remembered that was her name. And he said, she's my niece. And
yeah, that's funny. And it made a full circle, and you know, with
he grabbed
you
the
involved.
phone and dialed, and he goes, Mary, this is John. You'll never guess who I'm sitting across the table from. And so we had that.
That's awesome.
You know, it was a great story, very gratifying to this librarian, you know, to know that action, all those years ago, it had an impact. And I have not stayed in touch with her, and I'm not sure that she's still with us, but I'm sure she'd be interested to see where I've landed now after all these years, right square in the middle of this.
Yeah. No, I would say you're in the thick of it, that's for sure. But I would say you're right at the top. I mean, I've always enjoyed your approach, and I think that's why you're so well respected, and that you even have people like Jane Goodall and Brian Dunning, who is a skeptic himself, and yet gives you a nod, essentially, you know, of respect. So, you know, I think she would be very, very happy, very proud, you know, if she doesn't know already what's going on.
Right.
So.
Oh, I appreciate that. I've always tried to, to maintain that, generally with success, although I think some people might disagree with that on occasion, but
that's always going to be the case, right?
But it is. I find myself in a unique position. It's a different position. I don't really, deserve the distinction of being at the top. I'm really not. I'm in a particular spot as an academic.
In my mind, in my heart, you are, though. I mean, and that's just, how I feel about it. And a lot of people I know, they feel very much that way. But, it doesn't surprise me. You're a very humble man. So that doesn't shock me one bit.
Well, thanks.
So I'm kind of curious, though, about your background with anatomy and anthropology. How, what we know, like anatomically, about the Sasquatch. What have we been able to garner so far?
Well, actually, quite a bit. It's just that it's rather specialized knowledge, specialized interpretation, and so it isn't appreciated by not only the general public, the average Joe on the street, but even by many academics who don't have the background, many anthropologists who don't have the background to fully appreciate some of the things that I'm trying to draw attention to, which, and maybe I'm so close that I'm maybe missing something, but to me it seems so obvious, so blatantly clear that the only reason it isn't readily accepted is because of the implications of what it means, and so that as a result, I find myself in this position, this awkward position of being labeled as an apologist, as someone who's no longer scientific, because I've already decided, as they would assume, in the absence of any evidence, in the absence of a body, as Michael Shermer loved to say, or was wont to say, show me the body. The science starts once you have a body, and that's just the most unscientific statement that he could make. Because the science is a method of inquiry, a method of exploration as well. I mean, it really is. You're asking questions and generating hypotheses. That's part of the scientific method, and he's just pushing that aside because he doesn't have a context. One of the things I've really been pushing in my public presentations of late, and I put together this really great slide that illustrates it. I found an image of a tabletop with a puzzle, just not a landscape or anything distracting, just a plain puzzle with real emphasis on the outline of the individual puzzle pieces. And there's one piece of the puzzle that hasn't been placed in its spot yet. It's kind of just there on top of the puzzle. And I for the first slide, I cropped it so that piece appears not to have a place, not to have a position. The piece exists; it's real. It has defining characteristics and so forth, but there's no place for it. And that's the way the question of relic hominoids kind of finds itself right now, is that there hasn't been at least a context. And then of course in the next slide, I reduced the cropping so that you could see that blank spot and the puzzle pieces that frame in that blank spot, that define that spot, that create a context for it. And what we find in science is, and people have written books about this. Kuhn wrote that excellent book, back when I was in college, on scientific revolutions, which talked about paradigm shifts. It was the first time many of us had ever heard the term paradigm. And what he was trying to get across is that new ideas often have to wait an entire generation until the old school dies off, or until the framework, the context, the place for that new knowledge has been established. And we're just getting to the point where that framework is starting to take shape, so that people are going, maybe this isn't paranormal. This is absolutely normal. And why didn't we recognize this earlier? Because now, with the recognition of the bushy family tree, multiple species coexisting in the past, and many, many lineages persisting right up till the very recent past, if not the present, why should we think that the present is so exceptional, that we are the only hominin, the only hominoid, casting that a little more broadly, with the exception of the other great apes, and assume that all these other lineages have gone extinct in the face of so much evidence that speaks to the contrary,
Right.
Well, I have a question though. Like, if the concept of a Sasquatch or something bigger than us has been around for so long, like, why do you think we haven't found any remains?
Oh, well, the most straightforward answer, the simplest answer, is just the very nature of the beast, to borrow Brian Sykes' title of his book. When you consider the natural history, and that in concert with the physical and biological context, the environment that it's found in, I mean, we have to recognize, this is probably the most important point, the rarity of these individuals. And this is a species, there aren't tens of thousands, as some would suggest. When you go through the process, and it's a little, the explanations are probably a little bit too lengthy for this concept. But when you think about, I mean, I'm not just grabbing numbers out of the air. In other words, I've thought a lot about this. I thought a lot about things that other people have stumbled upon or have suggested regarding their range, the size of their home range. And when you extrapolate from natural history factors of the other great apes, I mean, if this creature, whether it's more closely related to us or more closely related to apes, it's nested within the hominoids. So if we look at that context, all of us, all of the hominoids, have a life expectancy somewhere on the order of 40 to 70 years, depending on health care and benefits and so forth. So the oldest great ape in captivity, where they were getting those health care benefits, was 62, which really rivals our own life expectancy. And so we know there's a positive correlation with longevity and body mass. Larger animals tend to live longer, have slower metabolic rates and so forth. So an animal of this size could conceivably live to be 60, 70, 80, maybe, perhaps. Probably in the wild, maybe not so much, but at least a half century. Animal, they therefore probably, as do other great apes, reproduce infrequently. Humans naturally reproduce less frequently if they're nursing. Nursing was a great is a great form of birth control, and individuals who nurse can put off recommencement of menses for 4 to 5 years.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's, and if I remember right, that's part of what's in, or it's some kind of pseudo drug that's in a lot of birth control pills.
Well,
is something that makes it tricks the body to make it think it's pregnant,
right. You know, nursing releases oxytocin and other hormones that suppress ovulation, and so in any case, my point is that generally across the great apes, the birth rates are low. You know, interbirth intervals anywhere from 2 to 4 to 6 years. Orangutans, it's up there in that 4 to 6 year range naturally. So long lifespans, slow reproductive rates, a lot of investment in the offspring. They're at the top of their food chain. They have no natural predators. They're going to live a long life. Now, if you took Idaho, for example, and looked at and put together a bunch of variables that we've kind of been toying with, things like their home range size, which I think is on par or on in the range of about 1,000 square miles at least. If you we know based on sightings and footprint finds that they tend to be solitary, so their social structure is probably such that they spend a lot of time foraging alone. That would suggest something more like an orangutan, where a male patrols or defends or broadcasts. It's hard to physically defend 1,000 square miles, but when you can bellow out a loud call that lets all the interlopers know that you're the biggest, baddest boy in town, that may explain some of these loud, screaming calls of Sasquatch. They're spacing themselves. They're announcing. They're communicating with each other, and they're letting each other know who's in this neck of the woods. So they're solitary. A male defending 1,000 square miles may overlap that of a female with an offspring. So if you look at a map, say of Idaho, another factor that many have pointed to is the correlation of credible reports with rainfall or precipitation levels, that is.
Right.
So excess of 16 to 18 inches of precipitation. There's the panhandle of Idaho. You swing across the central mountains. It's a little drier through the Sawtooth, and then gets wetter there up against the Targhee and the Caribou Forest along the eastern side. There's only about, if you try to fit about 1,000 square mile plots into that space, there's only room for about a dozen or so. 20 at most. So if you've got roughly 5, and it's going to vary with the logging, with secondary growth, with landscape, with drainages, all kinds of topographic
hunters,
and geographic aspects, then there's going to make some variation. It's not going to be a nice even patchwork. But the point is, in all of Idaho, there's maybe 70 individuals, maybe 100, 70 to 100. Now you stop and think, how many of those are in their golden years? How many? So how often is a death
That's a good
going
point.
to take place? There may be a turnover every year of 1 or 2 at the most, if even that, not even that rate. Every 5 years there might be 1 or 2, or every 10 years. So what are your chances of stumbling on that 1 or 2 bodies in the entire state of Idaho, which has more wilderness area than any other state in the lower 48? I mean, when you start thinking in those terms, and it's not surprising that we haven't found a body. That's not a damning fact. It's frustrating. It's very aggravating that we haven't, because it'd be nice. It would solve the whole thing if someone walked in with a job, too.
Hand in hand with a big old
But the fact that we haven't, that shouldn't negate all of the other trace and potential physical evidence, hair, scat, so forth, footprints, trace evidence, beds, nests, so forth, that point to there being something out there. I mean, again, you don't have to have the body to start asking the right questions and evaluating what evidence has been there. And and that's one of the things. The the naysayers readily get the negative evidence published. Like, there were hair samples that were found up in the Yukon, and they were turned into a Fish and Game, and they had them analyzed, and they turned out to be bison or muskox. can't remember the story now
Mm-hmm.
off the cuff, but that got published in Ecology Today, just like that. Because it was,
Of course,
it fits the paradigm that there isn't such a thing,
Right.
And I'm constantly winnowing through and evaluating and critiquing and setting aside evidence that is negative, but I don't publish it. I don't take the time or bother to report on it. I guess I should more often, just to show that I'm not gullible, that I don't just accept everything. I mean, the things that get me excited and that prompt me to pursue them represent a very small fraction of the email and telephone traffic that I get on a regular basis. So,
Right.
Well, what's interesting too is the amount of energy that's put into being a cynic more than even a skeptic. It's a little bit dumbfounding at times the amount that they'll go to in just getting one thing debunked or discounted and dismissed. But like you said, there's lots of other stuff out there without a body, of course, but still there's other things. But back to kind of what you were talking about too. You were talking about there could be Sasquatch in their golden years, and at some point they're going to pass. They're going to die, succumb to whatever illness or age. And I've always heard different stories about what Sasquatch will do with their dead.
Well,
and I'm just curious, what do you know?
The notion that they might, the suggestion that they might bury their dead, it's a possibility. It's worthy of consideration, I guess. I have thought about that, and just when you consider the lifestyle, and by that I mean the natural history, the solitary behavior, the tendency for solitary behavior, and so forth, and using examples from other great apes. I mean, even amongst hominids, we don't really even have good evidence that Neanderthals buried their dead, in spite of the popular notions that are out there. There have been some very good critical reviews of the evidence for intentional burials that have made a very compelling case, in my opinion, that there isn't a good case for intentional burials.
Sure.
If there have been intentional interments, it was basically shoving, it's too cold and the ground's too hard to do anything else, so just shove it to the back of the cave and cover it over so it doesn't stop smelling. You can get out of here,
right?
Type of thing. But the notion of being buried with bouquets of flowers, that was discounted after more thorough and systematic sampling of the sediments in that Shanidar cave that was so famous, and so on. But I mean, you look at the other great apes, and when they die, they just go off on their own somewhere, and their remains are rarely found.
They just leave them.
Right.
Sure.
Well, it makes sense if they lead a solitary life, they do the same when they pass.
And so, I mean, what would be the chances, if they are that solitary, what would be the chances of them, especially an aged, decrepit individual who's probably gone off and secreted themselves somewhere out of the way, to be found by another member of their species who had then the wherewithal?
Right.
What would they use to dig a hole deep enough to bury a Sasquatch? Just digging a hole.
That'd have to be a big hole.
Yeah.
Well, I know.
That's a big
digging
hole.
a cat hole to do your business in the woods is a challenge sometimes. with a heel or with a little plastic trowel or a metal trowel. If you had no other tools, and that's just the other point, is the level of the evidence for the intelligence of these creatures. I mean, unless you want to adopt a position that they are at one with nature and time and space, and need no accoutrements to make their living in the wild, then as an intelligent being, I mean, other animals get along just fine, but that's it. They're animals. They get along fine with their intelligence combined with instinct and with the wherewithal that they're blessed with. And Sasquatch have a impressive physique, presumably a massive body size, and so many witnesses have described with awe their muscularity and their power climbing or covering ground very rapidly, and I mean that's their adaptation. Their facial skeleton, as evidenced by the subject on the Patterson-Gimlin film, suggests an adaptation for extremely deep, heavy jaws. If we point to Gigantopithecus or another pre-human hominin like Paranthropus, as I've discussed elsewhere, I mean they chew their way through the environment basically. Huge jaws, and in the case of both Paranthropus and Gigantopithecus, very, very thick molar enamel and flat molars that are just as one of my colleagues described the robust Australopithecines, they're Cuisinarts. They can just grind up all sorts of things that
right. Big, huge mandibles, and to support that tooth that's there to be able to crush and grind and shred up.
Well, I want to step back. You've mentioned it twice now. The Patterson-Gimlin film.
Oh,
what are your thoughts?
No question that in my mind at this point that it's authentic. I mean, as confident as I could be, not having been there. Let's qualify it to that degree. But otherwise, I mean, if I had just the footprints that were cast by Roger and by Bob Titmus, plus the added benefit of seeing the motion of the foot and ankle of that subject of the film, I would be convinced that it was genuine. But then, with all of my other knowledge of anatomy and my lengthy discussions, I've had the good fortune of working together with Bill Munns on some of his projects, and have been able to attract some funding to help him get some funding to keep him working on some of those projects. But we've co-authored one paper, and we're working on a second one now, and he's published his book, which summarizes a great deal of the analysis that he has already conducted. I mean, there's no question. Unfortunately, there are so many misstatements that linger. There are things that were said back in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s, when physical anthropology and the hominid fossil record was just beginning really to reach its, if you can call it such a thing, a golden era, where our understanding was really starting to mushroom. But things, I mean, just simple things like it has hair on its breasts. Primates typically don't have hair on their breasts, therefore it's fake. That's the most inane statement. And even at the time it was made, I mean, any anatomist knows that, I mean, even human female breasts have hair follicles. If you can generate a goosebump, there's a hair follicle there, fine though it may be. Right. That goose flesh is the result of contraction of these little tiny muscles, the erector pili muscles, that are attached at the base of individual hair follicles. So if you have goose flesh on your breasts, you ladies out there, when it gets cold, then you have hair. Fine.
Then you have hair.
Right. Well, if you look, you have peach buzz all over your body.
It's just very fine. Hair. But you look at chimpanzees, and gorillas tend to have a somewhat barer breasts, barer chests, both the males and the females. But chimpanzees have hair covering their breasts, and as do orangutans. So it's that kind of a statement, and there are many others. I mean, we could sit and rattle off statement after statement after statement that were made by the so-called experts at the time, which keep getting rehearsed even now, and thrown out as negative evidence for the Patterson-Gimlin film, and they're just baseless.
That's the disheartening thing too, is that there's even a lot of people, researchers around that I've run into and either read their stuff or seen their stuff some way somehow, and it's very disheartening to see how naive a lot of folks are about a lot of this stuff. And by no means am I claiming that I understand it all, but the thing is, I keep that open mind, that I try to say, okay, some of these arguments thrown out there, they are unfounded, or there's no real truth behind them a lot of the time. So I've learned to just kind of take it with a grain of salt, do my own research, and form my own opinion from that.
And real, sincere sort of skepticism or critical thinking is useful. And in any undertaking, we send our papers out for peer reviews so that others can critically evaluate them. We send our books out for reviews so we can get feedback. And that pressure, that current, helps us then to refine our own arguments, to see things from a different perspective. It's the ideological skeptics, those who are skeptical for the sake of skepticism. They doubt everything, that I have a bone to pick with, and the Michael Shermers and the Benjamin Radfords. Benjamin's a nice guy. They're all nice guys, but they sometimes they wear that skepticism like it was a badge of honor, and my friend David, friend in a collegial sense, and I'll use the word colleague in that sense. I got slammed for referring to one person as a colleague, as if that was an endorsement of everything that they ever said or did, as if I was working hand in hand with that person. A colleague is another person who's out there just doing what they do and have some common ground. But David Daglin, has a section on his webpage titled, under his various areas of interest, critical thinking and skepticism. I'm thinking, why would that be a special area of interest? I mean, it's something. It's one key on the keyboard. We all hit it at the appropriate time when we're playing a melody, or it's one thread in a tapestry of scientific inquiry. But if you pound one key,
well spoken,
or if you pull one thread, you spoil the song, or you spoil the fabric. I mean, that's not the role of skepticism. And so that, I've like I said, I've got a bit of a bone to pick.
Well, and it's pretty understandable too, especially after years and years of hearing some of this stuff, or being, almost like a target of sorts for these kind of things. Yeah, it can get under one's goose fleshy, skin. So, I'm kind of curious though, like, have you ever personally laid eyes on a Sasquatch out in the wild? Not that there's one in captivity, but you know what I mean.
Well, I may have. There was one experience that occurred last fall when I was up in Alberta, and I was actually with Todd Standing. He had invited me up there to have the opportunity to see some of the evidence that he was marshaling, and in the field at one of his sites, one of the sites that he worked in, let's put it that way. And we'd been there for several days. Myself, Todd Standing, and John Bindernagel, and Sonia Zohar. And to make the story short, there quite late that evening, there were some vocalizations which Todd identified as being similar to the things that he has typically heard in that area previously. When John finally did, John Bindernagel, unfortunately, is becoming a little bit hard of hearing, which puts him just a little deficit when it comes to hearing some of those faint vocalizations. So he didn't pick up on it immediately. When I heard it, I must admit, it had a bit of a avian quality to it. We'd heard some hoot owls, some just regular, or I should say more typical owl sounds, more recognizable owl sounds. Later, John suggested this was a sawhut owl, which is a little owl. It's only about maybe 6 to 8 inches tall, if I remember correctly. Right. But whatever had made this sound was walking on the ground, and it sounded more like an elk or a moose than it did a 6 or 8 inch tall owl hopping along in the underbrush. And so actually, Sonia approached it. Sonia considers herself something of a, what would you call it? She's not a animal psychic, more sympathetic or a whisperer, yeah. She just has a knack with animals, and animals seem to come to her quite rarely, even wild animals. Out at her property, she always has animals in the backyard, and she's butts up against the woods and so forth. Yeah,
like Snow
there you
White.
go. Well, so she got up and was approaching into the darkness the spot that these sounds of brush popping were emanating.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm watching through night vision. Todd's got a video camera videotaping what's taking place. And I mean, basically, she was talking coaxingly, reassuringly to it, to whatever it was, and apparently getting interaction. I mean, she'd say something, and there no vocalization, but the sound of brush popping, breaking, branches breaking, that's in response.
Right.
And then I could see that she was a little taken aback by something, and she pointed out her knees were shaking, and she retreated back to the fire ring and sat down beside me, and she just said she had kind of an ominous, foreboding sort of feelings, a depressive feeling come over her,
Wow.
and she backed away. Well, at that point, the wind shifted just a little bit, and smoke was in my face, and I stood up and moved around to the far side of the fire ring closer, and was watching still through the night vision when suddenly literally from the spot that she was interacting towards, or addressing her attention towards, let's put it that way, there was a movement and a shadowy figure, which I could only see from about the waist up. We were camped at the end of a road that was blocked off by about a 3-foot berm with some vegetation, grass and weeds. And the fire was, of course, reflecting off of that topography, and I could only see beyond. So it blocked the lower part of it, whatever it was. But I tell you, if what my eye saw, my mind's eye, or my mind saw, if you could picture walking in the reverse direction, Patty from the Patterson-Gimlin film, but in complete silhouette, just black, against the light granite gravel of the road that continued on beyond the berm, striding from one dark tree line to the next about, it went at an angle, so it became obscured by the trees to the left. So I saw it just, taking the equivalent probably of, half a dozen steps, coming up from this little gully across the road and then disappearing into a gap in the trees on the far side. And I tell you, I sat there for a minute and just kind of moved the night vision monocular back and forth. That's the one disadvantage, is when you're using a monocular, you've got one eye closed, and so you have no depth of depth perception. Everything's kind of flat. And when you've been staring with one eye closed through that lens, that kind of speckly green. I mean, it was a high end. It was a 3rd generation ITT night vision monocular. So it's quite an impressive clarity. Much better than anything else off the shelf. And but yet I almost didn't say anything. But then I thought to myself, well, gee whiz, what are we here for? And given the context of what just took place, should it be that surprising that it broke off in that direction? So I brought it up. We weren't inclined at that point to, especially after Sonia's experience and perception of pursuing it off into the woods. It was very, very dark. No moon at that point. The moon had dropped down below the tree line, and then I had to leave before dawn the next morning to make it back to the airport. John stayed along with Sonia and John and Todd, excuse me. And I admonished them, really look at that hillside carefully. Find some evidence of what I think I saw.
For footprints.
Which they
That's a fascinating story.
And what bad timing though that you had to go.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do real quick is go ahead and jump into taking a break, and then we'll come back and we'll hit you with some more questions as well, and take the rest of the show out
Very
from
good.
that point. Okay. Welcome back to ASEP Radio. This is Ben Robison.
And I'm Nicole Katsanis.
So we're going to pick up here in a second with Mr. Jeff Meldrum and continue our amazing conversation. I'm just having a blast listening to all this wealth of knowledge, so it's been very fun for me. But real quick, let's do a quick shout out.
Yes, we'd like to give a shout out to Mr. Mike Smith over at the InfoSub Radio Network. Mike airs ASEP Radio, giving us worldwide exposure, so we're very thankful for Mike and the InfoSub Radio Network for all you do for us here at ASEP Radio. So thank you, thank you, thank you. You can check out the InfoSub Radio Network along with all of the other great content they provide, not just us, by visiting their Facebook page at www.facebook.com/theinfosub. Or you can visit their website at www.infosub.listen2myradio.com, and it's the number 2.
Awesome.
Spelled out.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mike. All right, so back with you, Mr. Meldrum. We kind of were, we were talking about your experience when you believe you may have seen one in the dark. I was going to quickly share with you, I've lived in Idaho, Wyoming, Oregon, Washington, and I actually lived in a town that you're probably familiar with in Idaho called Kamei. And so I've, seen the wilderness out there. The Clearwater wilderness is beautiful and also steeped with claims Bigfoot. But it was when I was about 12, I lived up in the Olympic Peninsula of here in Washington State. And believe it or not, I was at that fringe of where they allowed people that lived in rural areas to have what they call a hardship license. And I, at the age of 12, was able to drive around in that rural area that we lived in. And it just had started snowing, and I was driving on the road, and on my left would be a clear cut of forest that was gone, and then on the right was untouched forest. And about what I could only guess to be, at the best, especially you're talking from a 12-year-old, about a mile in front of me, I saw an upright, bipedal, dark-colored figure walk from out of the clear cut across the road, the highway, into the woods. And it made it across, from coming out of the ditch on the left-hand side of the road, which was the clear cut, across the road in it was, I don't even think 2 seconds. It didn't look like it was running. So I tried to pull up, and the snow was just starting to stick on the ground. So I was like, oh man, I might get to see a footprint. And it didn't that I could find, or I wasn't in the right spot, because again, I was trying to guesstimate where I was.
Sure.
And then I had a car coming up behind me, so I couldn't just hang out in the road. But I think I've actually seen one as well myself. But again, it was a mile away, and I couldn't really make out any detail. But I wish there would have been prints. That's all I could say.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
So, what do you think? When it comes to conditions or an environment for Sasquatch, what do you think is ideal conditions? Because you've got claims of Sasquatch all across the world. Mm-hmm. So the conditions and environments are going to be different, but I assume they've got to be somewhat the same for them.
Well, true, and while there are Sasquatch-like creatures and very close in similarity to Sasquatch reported and described in parts of Asia, it actually isn't the whole world. There are, and I've told this story before, and some may have heard it, but I was on an airplane traveling at one time and had grabbed a magazine in the airport and was reading it, and there was an article about the imperiled status of the Asian tigers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the graphics really jumped out at me because it showed Asia. It showed in one color the former range, and I since located a similar graphic to that, but it showed the former range of, like at the turn of the century, back in 1900s, of the Asian tiger, and it covered much of East Asia and down south through India and up against the Himalayas and clear up into the Caucasus and Mongolia.
Sure.
And then it showed that range, or the range of the tigers today, or as of I think it was 1990 was the data, and it was fragmented. It was a fraction of that former range. But what struck me about this was, I had previously been and still look long and hard for examples of footprints of Sasquatch-like characteristics in the footprints throughout Asia. And having done that, this graphic took on even more significance. And I've created a slide I show in my presentations that points out where these different examples have come from, of the Yeren, of the Ngoy Rung, of the Manda Barung, of the Dev in the Caucasus. They're all in areas where there have been, or there are tigers today.
I see.
In other words, not that there's a link to tigers, except that they share common ecological habitat requirements. Thick, wet forests is basically what they thrive in.
No, Jeff, I think it's the tigers. I think you've pinned it right there. Where there's tigers, there's Bigfoot.
Right. So, and it's curious too, because that they're supposedly extinct in the Caucasus, but yet we still get Sasquatch reports of Sasquatch-like creatures there, and then of late there have been sightings of these Asian tigers in the Caucasus region that there might still be persisting. So, kind of interesting. But the same kind of logical approach can be taken to North America. I cringe every time I hear repeated on a documentary that or see a graphic that shows Sasquatch reports across the entire United States and Canada, because yes, there are reports.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily equate with the existence of
Right.
Sasquatch
Or the habitat for them to.
exactly. And if you use that same kind of criteria that we mentioned when we were talking about range in Idaho across the United States, where is there 16 to 17, 18 inches or more of annual precipitation? And there is a distinctive pattern. And in fact, another interesting correlation, if you open up a Peterson's Guide to Mammals and look at the range distribution of black bears across North America, it's remarkably similar to that precipitation map that you would derive using that cutoff of 16 to 18 inches or more.
Right.
And that's where I think the credible reports of Sasquatch have merit. But things that, now there are some exceptions, but because, and the only caveat I make there is, again, if we fall back to possible conjectures or conjectures about possible social structure, in that social structure I described with a dominant male and overlapping females, when those females have young adult males and offspring in their company, they're going to reach a point where the male will not tolerate their presence.
Right.
And they're going to be driven off to look for their own habitat, their own niche. And on occasions, those kind of rogue males, if you will, in other species as well, are sometimes seen in odd places, not prime real estate, not prime habitat. They're, historically, when Peter Byrne was investigating sightings of Bigfoot in near Hood River,
Yeah.
It was on the leeward side of the Cascades. It's out in sagebrush.
Right.
He had that blind built up on the hillside, and you looked out across there, and what are the chances of seeing a Sasquatch out in the middle of that kind of country? Well, maybe that was a rogue male that was had been driven out of a young adult male, been driven out of its natal range by a dominant male, and it's out looking for its own
territory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like in anything, there's always going to be the outlier. So.
Well, of course, exactly.
Now, is there? And I know we don't have any particular number, but is there an area that seems to have a more denser population of individuals versus other parts of the areas that are known for them?
Well, again, considering what we've discussed about regarding their habitat requirements and range size, again, I said the range size is going to vary with topography, but also with the productivity. And there's that sweet spot. If you get too much rainfall, it makes it hard for some plants to grow. It makes for more acidic soils and so forth. But you get in that sweet range where you have good mosaic environment with lots of understory, lots of secondary growth. It's really the fruiting plants in temperate forests are in the understory.
Right.
The ground cover of blueberries or huckleberries or all the other berries. That's where the sugar source is, and there's plenty of carbohydrates in the form of lichens and leaves, and
right.
and then protein is the other essential element there in the diets. And so, also bearing in mind that everything points to Sasquatch being very generalized, a generalized omnivore with, again, as we discussed, those Cuisinart jaws.
Yeah.
So they can and other aspects. I mean, this is what's interesting too. The skeptics have said, I shouldn't say the skeptics, but skeptical opinions have voiced or opined that in places where there already is a large omnivore, you couldn't have another one.
Right.
They appeal to the competitive exclusion principle. There can be only one species in any particular niche, and so if you've got a large omnivore in the form of a bear, then how could you have a large omnivore primate make a living? Well, you do it in different ways. A bear is evolved from a carnivore ancestor. It has the jaws of a former carnivore. It's broadened the teeth out a little bit. It doesn't have that carnassial shear of a real carnivore, although it's able to chew its way through protein quite readily, as we know, especially from all the recent rash of grizzly attacks in Yellowstone we've had. But they also have a lengthened gut, but the gut is derived from a carnivore, which has a very short gut. So relatively, compared to other herbivore folivores, a bear has a pretty short gut. On the other hand, if you look at the Sasquatch, it would presumably be derived from a large hominoid ancestor, where adaptations for frugivory and folivory were predominant. Carnivory is a secondary,
Right.
or a secondary or less, or more recent. I meant to say, not say secondary twice, but adaptation. And so, and one of the legacies of that folivore ancestry might be that they have the digestive physiology, the necessary enzymes to digest some of that, or the flora, the gut flora that can digest cellulose. So some types of leaves and vegetative matter might be more digestible. One of the examples that I point to frequently is that I was told that the Native Americans, the tribal peoples in the Puget Sound area, have said, this was by way of, I think, Rick Knoll, that they eat alder leaves. Well, alder is a very prolific riparian vegetation. Which bears cannot eat. They can't digest the cellulose in alder leaves. If you can eat alder leaves, there's a not perennial, but there is a huge salad bar, never-ending salad bar during the season when those leaves are there. So that's my point is, and then you combine the gut physiology with the chewing mechanics. of that short-faced, flat-faced, deep-jawed, thick enameled molars that presumably the Sasquatch has, it's going to eat tougher, more fibrous foods that are unavailable to a bear to masticate or to digest. So there's that. Plus, if they're as generalized as they seem, they're adaptable. And black bears are to a large extent, too. I mean, look at the diversity of habitats that black bears have made a living, stretching from, the western coast down to the deep southeast.
Right.
Then if a black bear could make a living, a Sasquatch presumably could as well. And there's a remarkable similarity in their distributions. I mean, so much so there was a paper that was published, which was actually written with the intent of critiquing some of the software packages that are being used to evaluate ecological data. And they were kind of showing that you could throw in, just about any data, and it'll create some kind of a model to accommodate it. And to demonstrate that, they sort of tongue-in-cheek used Bigfoot data. Now, one of my good friends, Peter Anello, was one of the co-authors, and Peter's quite open-minded, quite sympathetic and intrigued by the Sasquatch phenomenon, and has spoken publicly and written. He's published a paper in my Relic Hominoid Inquiry journal. But they did this kind of like, there's such a remarkable congruence between the data for Sasquatch and the data and distribution data for black bears that may say something. Maybe Sasquatch sightings can be dismissed as just bear misidentifications because of that coincidence. And I in a personal message, sort of accosted Peter and said, "What gives? I thought you were more open-minded about this." And he said he was, and he said, in fact, his co-authors are as well. But they knew they would never get a paper published if they betrayed that attitude.
That's unfortunate.
I know. So they intentionally kind of adopted this rather skeptical posture and sort of, added a couple little quips here that wouldn't give away their true feelings. His other two co-authors were quite impressed, in fact, by the nature of the Sasquatch data, that it really did suggest that there was an ecological basis for the pattern of sightings of this, unknown, mysterious creature.
And that's what's a bummer, is there's so much there that helps back and solidify and add some kind of credence to what, what could very much be a North American ape, in our backyard, but yet it's unpopular. It's not it's too, I don't want to say woo-woo because seems to be a different area, but it's just too much for people to want to grasp on.
Well, it cuts against the grain on a couple of levels, and one of those we've kind of alluded to, this notion of having a context. But then there is this other aspect that Nicole kind of touched on with one of her first questions, and that, where's the body? And that is, there are just a lot of people out there, a lot of academics, and a lot of outdoorsmen who say, it just can't possibly, there isn't an animal like that out there. There can't be an animal like that out there. It's we would know about it. And it's so funny. I mean, again, you have to. I've talked to so many outdoorsmen who had that same attitude until they had their experience.
And same for me. I grew up around hunters and whatnot, and lots of avid, outdoorsmen. And they're like, well, then why have I never seen or ran into it? And I'm like, okay, what am I to do and say to that? I could. Usually that kind of company is not interested in your, data, especially if it goes over their head and it's not something they're interested in knowing. So there's half the time you're just like, there's no reason to even argue this or debate it.
Yeah. A very, renowned colleague of mine, Jim Halfpenny, just recently in a conversation, he reiterated the fact that he has spent, 30 plus years in the field, a lot of that time in very remote areas and hiking around and on foot. He said in all that time, he has never found the skeleton of a bear.
Hmm.
All that time he's been out there, and so he just wanted to register his affirmation of the notion that it's not out of the question that a creature could exist, and yet we haven't found its remains. Because
agreed.
And you take Idaho again. If there's 75 to 100 in all of Idaho, there's 8,000 to 10,000 bear in the state of Idaho, black bear, and I don't know how many tens of thousands of mule deer. And yet you go out hiking in the spring, and there have been literally thousands of deer that have died over the winter, and yet you don't trip over carcasses every day walking around in the woods. Nature has its way of consuming those things, and what isn't readily consumed by the biological factors, then you've got the physical factors, and in wet coniferous forests, and particularly in the Northwest, where there's also the added factor of volcanic soils. The conditions are quite acidic, and
I read something about that recently that talks about how skeletal remains will not last long in the Pacific Northwest because of the acidic value.
Right. And one of the only places, and here's a good opportunity to put a kind of a shout out to your listeners who are amateur or whatever capacity, or spelunkers, or like to explore caves and nooks and crannies, and do it carefully and safely. But
yes, no one get hurt out
limestone caves, not lava tubes or volcanic deposits, but limestone caves would be the most likely place that we might find remains, or stream beds in areas where there are more non-igneous sedimentary rocks, put it that way, limestone and perhaps some sandstone, but even quartz and granite, those tend to make for slightly more acidic conditions of the water. But
so we're looking for more like sedimentary.
Well, it's just the where there are minerals that are more alkaline.
Okay.
That and granitic rocks tend not to be such, as they deteriorate and break down. Granitic and basaltic rocks don't. They produce more acidic conditions.
Gotcha.
But a good friend of mine is a paleontologist who specializes in, I shouldn't say good friend, an acquaintance, I don't know him that well, but a colleague. But he specializes in excavating Pleistocene deposits in limestone caves in southeastern Alaska.
Oh, wow.
Now that seems to be the perfect the perfect activity for someone interested in looking for Sasquatch bones. And yet I said, well, then tell me, have you stumbled on any odd primate-like skeletal remains? And he said, no. And I said, well, assume for just a moment that Sasquatch does exist, were to exist, hypothetically. Would that fact surprise you? And he says, no, absolutely not. He said, well, think about it. He said, they've excavated probably 6 or 7 caves. And he has a really good website. And so this now reveals that he's not a close acquaintance. I'm trying to remember his name. It's just off the tip of my tongue. But in any case, he's got a nice webpage that I'm sure if you Google Pleistocene cave excavations, you'll find it. Alaska.
Okay.
But in any case, 6 or 7 caves right down to bedrock. And in those, he said, you can probably count on 2 hands the number of bear fossil remains that we've found.
Oh, okay.
And so think of all the tens of thousands of bear that have come and gone and lived in those caves, and yet, even under those conditions, they said what they find are tend to be the smaller animals, the animals that either live in the cave all the time, like rodents and so forth, bats and things, or things that are dragged in intermittently by predators or scavengers.
Okay.
And the great example, the illustration of that principle is Gigantopithecus again. Because here you've got a species that, based on what fossils we have, we know resided in East Asia for 1.5 million years as a species. Gigantopithecus blacki, the largest and most recent species.
Mm-hmm.
1.5 million years, and yet for all that tenure in East Asia, we have 2 jawbones and a few thousand isolated teeth.
It's crazy.
And we only have those because porcupines dragged them into the caves and chewed them all up, with the exception of the thickest, hardest elements.
Sure.
Like the thick bodies of the jaws. All the thin ascending ramus is chewed away. The roots of the teeth up to the dentin are chewed away, and just leaving this big, thick enameled crowns. And so we only have fossils of Gigantopithecus, and one of the reasons it's been stereotyped as tropical is because we only have them south of the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, in southern China and in Vietnam. But I think, and I've been trying to get other paleontologists to discuss this with me in China, and have had some conversations. I think the fact that that porcupines are not found north of the Yellow River is why we don't find any Gigantopithecus bones in caves north of the Yellow River. Not that they didn't exist there, because I think Gigantopithecus, its gigantic size was an adaptation for endothermy. It was a temperately adapted ape, in my opinion.
Sure.
And I think eventually we'll find fossils up through the northeastern part of Asia in those temperate forests and temperate ravines.
Kind of to change gears a bit and humor me on this too. I know you've been faced with this concept and whatnot, and I think I know the answer, but what is your theory on some folks talking about Sasquatch being a dimensional being?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know why Sasquatch would be singled out with that particular ability. I see it as an animal, as a biological species. I don't even see it based on the evidence of its described appearance and behaviors of having a near human intelligence. It's a hypothesis that's intriguing, but it falls that becomes paranormal because we can't test it empirically. There's no trace. It's only the only substantiation that is offered is negative results. The lack of bodies, the lack of finding physical remains, basically is what's pointed to. And I just don't think you have to appeal to a supernatural. Well, not that necessarily. I'm not ruling out interdimensional portals as a natural element of the physical universe, but it's one that we have no knowledge of at this point. So
it's a hard one for me to even wrap my mind around. I try to be open about all those things. I was pretty confident that you'd be open to the plausibility of it, but I didn't so much think that you were banking your money on that.
No.
And
if you just stop and ask the question, then a being that is capable of manipulating interdimensional portals, what's the attraction of the Pacific Northwest with 18 plus inches of precipitation?
Right.
Why don't they turn up in
the Bahamas?
Times Square?
Or down at Miami Beach or something.
Yeah, and they well anyway.
I totally I could tell.
Everything else about them, they behave like animals, not like highly advanced people who
can jump in and out of different dimensions.
I think they would have a leave no trace principle. That's what I was getting.
Yeah, they'd be on hoverboards. Come on, Jeff, right?
Yeah, there you go. The technology, it's just hard to put those two things together.
Yeah.
The idea. And maybe that's a bias. I'll admit that may be a bias. We have as a species, or as a lineage, even before our species, we have a long legacy of as George Carlin would say, of toting stuff around.
Yeah.
We have to have our stuff. We collect it, we store it, we carry it, we use it. We just don't. There aren't people that make a living a la natural.
I do believe, though, George Carlin used a different word instead of stuff. But
Did he?
I think so. Well, we're talking about George Carlin,
Well, maybe I've been making the wrong allusion.
No.
I've all heard it as our stuff.
Yeah.
You think a different a word with a different letter?
He may have two versions for all I know, too.
Maybe. I've got the PG version.
Yeah. So when was the last time you got to do any field research?
Actually, I was, you mentioned the Clearwater. I was up there just a week ago.
Oh, sweet.
But got chased out by the fires.
Oh man.
I was doing just a little reconnoitering with another gentleman, and I'm not at liberty to discuss too much because they don't want his activities publicized at the moment. But we were up in that neck of the woods, and boy, unfortunately, I had pored over Google Earth and done the flyover at whatever elevation that zoom feature permits, or altitude, not elevation, altitude. And I picked an area, this beautiful valley that was offset from the Forest Service road, but at a reasonable hike to get a group back in there to do some more systematic surveying. A long, meandering, fairly large creek with lots of sandbars, and which was I was very keen about monitoring those for a short period of time and setting up some cameras for a longer period coming back. But it was completely burned over.
Oh. Wow.
When we got there, it was like a graveyard. I mean, it was, well, not like a graveyard. I mean, but lots of standing trees, but they were just literally pikes. And the new growth was about 7 years old. Count those. They're not called instars on trees, but the inter-branch segments. They were about 7 years old, and we confirmed that with the local forester. And beautiful secondary growth. But that was the other sad thing, is that the huckleberry bushes were completely devoid of any fruit. They had just dry husks or dry clumps of flowers. And so in the week of tromping around, not a single bear sign. We saw, in fact, precious little wildlife in some of those areas, just because of the drought conditions. I mean, the creeks are still flowing. So there's fish and frogs and there's those kind of things, but unfortunately we had a mandatory evacuation order that caused us to leave promptly because the fire, one of the fires was just 2 miles away.
Wow.
And closing on us fast, and the next morning's forecast was 30-mile-an-hour winds.
Wow.
I tell you, and I keep looking at different other areas that I might do. Consider doing some more, picking up and doing some more field work. And right now,
everything's on fire. Yeah,
everything's on fire, and the smoke is, depressing some of the wildlife movement and activity, and makes it hard to work in the field too.
Well, when there's not, impending doom of fire and such, like, what's the Jeff Meldrum game plan? Like, how do you go about your field research?
Well, I've just been kind of retooling, gearing back up. When Melba Ketchum announced her project, my number one goal in the field and working with John Mayenzinski has been to get tissues that would be sufficient to yield DNA from which a conclusive sequence could be derived. And so that's what we were trying to do in the field. And that was the primary. Of course, secondary, we wanted to have encounters. We wanted to collect trace evidence and find physical evidence in the form of remains or something, or bones or whatever. But the first step was to get that DNA so a species could be identified and recognized. And since she claimed to have numerous samples, all of which had yielded DNA. I mean, not a single one of her 112 some or whatever it was, 100 plus samples turned out to have negative results. we thought, well, let's give her a chance, and instead of expending our time and resources and effort out in the field again, let's redirect. And so I did, and that's when we launched the relic hominoid inquiry. That's when I really started getting the footprints scanned, and after much travail with unresponsive technicians, my hope is to have that website back up by the end of I was going to say by the end of summer.
Yeah.
It pretty much is.
Started
Yeah.
this week. I forgot. So within a couple of weeks, I'm in a transition now where the one senior tech actually has taken a faculty position and is leaving, and so he's turning the reins off to another fellow, and I'm working with him now to get things had not progressed along as much, and we're having to reinvent the wheel a little bit.
Well, fingers crossed
Anyway,
that
the
goes
point
well.
I'm sorry, I have a tendency to digress.
No, that's fine.
So I had poured my efforts into those kind of things, working with Bill Munns, doing some of the other sorts of laboratory-based analyses, forensic analyses, and had stopped doing much field work. And that lasted, that kind of dragged on, and then the results were extremely were dubious at first, and then absolutely disappointing.
Right.
Sham in the end, in my opinion, and then we had high hopes for the Sykes results, the Sykes study, Brian Sykes, the Oxford geneticist, and unfortunately there were some issues with, just the design, and he became, inundated with samples. This is the important thing, because one thing that I really want to foster is this attitude or this strategy, if you will, of taking full advantage in a positive way, a positive sense, of the resource of what I want to call the citizen scientist.
Right.
I don't like the word amateur enthusiast, because many enthusiasts who aren't doing this and being paid for it are very skilled, very talented, bring all kinds of expertise to bear. So they're not amateur by any stretch of the imagination. But we're always kind of grappling for a way to label them, because they're not academics with maybe with a PhD or behind their names. But one of the things that I've really wanted to do is to foster that kind of collaborative effort. And unfortunately, in many instances, well-intentioned investigators don't realize that hair is a remarkably resilient tissue. That keratin holds up, and that's why we have it as protection, and presumably our ancestors were covered with it to protect them from the environment. It persists for a long time out there, and so a case in point was that the Yukon gaff, where there was probably legitimate sighting. I never talked to the witnesses, but I have a hard time believing that anyone would mistake a bison or a muskox for a Sasquatch, even looking end on.
That would be pretty.
But after their sighting, they went up to the fence, the barbed wire fence or the branch or whatever the circumstance was, and they plucked off some strands of stray hair that were there that caught their eye for whatever reason. And so the point is, Dr. Sykes was, rather than screen the hair, he, and to his credit, to a degree, didn't want to bias his approach to the question by any presupposition about what Sasquatch hair should look like. We don't know. We have the gold standard, as Dr. Henry Fehrenbach has referred to it, based on lots and lots of consistent samples that show a suite of characteristics that most closely ally it to humans, even though none of them have cut ends. And there are a few other distinctions. For example, the remarkable consistency of the lack of a cellular medulla, which has always made it difficult to get DNA from. And that was one of the red flags.
Right.
Melba's study. Every one of the samples she received was Sasquatch. And in an effort to try to screen some hair samples for Dr. Sykes, I had received probably 10 to a dozen samples, and 90% of them were immediately disqualified as guard hairs of common wildlife that are out there. And so, what's wrong with this picture? 90% of what I got was eliminated. Could be identified as some other form of wildlife. 100% of what Melba got was Bigfoot.
You just got the bad batch. Well,
yeah, I guess so. I just had it. And then, of course, unfortunately, 100% of what Brian Sykes tested was non-Sasquatch.
Right.
Although, I have to say, because of the close affinity of Sasquatch to humans by comparison to anything else, even chimpanzees, presumably, we can only separate chimpanzees by maybe 1 or 2% difference in the nucleotide sequence.
Right.
So what about Sasquatch? Now, presumably we can distinguish Neanderthal genes from our own based on, it's even a smaller fraction. You have to do a huge amount of sequencing in order to find those differences. So if you're doing a very limited sample of just 1 or 2 genes, and this is something I hope to discuss with Dr. Sykes, and I've already sort of re-established some communication with him, and I'm in the process of identifying some funds that we can thoroughly and conclusively do the sequencing until we know exactly what that thing is. And even if it's closely related to us, we can distinguish it based on that.
That'd be awesome.
1, 2, or 0.5% difference.
That would be, yeah. That's ideal. So, that's what you're trying to do. That's the intention of all these, studies and, collections of hairs and whatever to try to get that kind of stuff.
So since we're back to square one, I was just going to say I'm beginning to retool again because we got to get back out in the field and develop techniques that of hair sampling that will, or tissue sampling or whatever, find that so that we can get some tissue with known provenience and good documented chain of custody, avoid contamination so that it can't dismiss it as human because due to contamination.
Right.
So that's that. And the other thing, that struck me as I was trudging along with just a day pack, but a pretty hefty day pack, was I don't want to say the futility, but the inefficiency of boots on the ground alone for short periods of time to try to identify. This gentleman who I didn't name, as we were planning this outing, this event, and he was trying to think of all the equipment, the standard kinds of fare that you might think of for a field operation. And he said, okay, now, what are our chances of success? And I just kind of had to throw my hands up and say, well, you can have all your T's crossed, all your I's dotted. You can have you can have the best FLIR, the best night vision, best camera traps, trail cams. And if there's not a Sasquatch in that drainage that you happen to choose to investigate, to explore, it's all for naught. No matter how much time you spend. So it struck me once again as we were on the ground and thinking about these strategies, the biggest omission from previous investigations have been sustained aerial surveillance.
Right.
And so we're back to the premise of the Falcon project as proposed by William Barnes. We've got to use these kinds of aerial technologies, and so
like drones. I'm assuming is what you're meaning.
Excuse me?
Drones.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Unmanned aerial vehicles. Yeah. Because the problem is, and it has to be that, because we discussed with there's a new outfit here in Idaho that approached me about employing their services of thermal imaging on fixed-winged aircraft, Cessna, to look for Sasquatch. But when I proposed nighttime flights, they go, "Oh, that's out of the question." we can't fly. You can't fly in central Idaho at night.
Right.
It's just that simple. Especially if you're, trying to follow these drainage and so forth. I mean, it's been a while since I've been that far north in Idaho, and boy, the topography. A lot of it's vertical.
Part of the problem too with the technology right now with UAVs or drones and such is the battery life on the ones that are battery powered like that.
Exactly.
They just don't have any,
And that's why it's got to be. I mean, those have their place in some instances, but the real workhorse is going to have to be helium filled. It's going to have to be an airship that doesn't rely on a 20-minute battery life.
Oh, so you're talking about more of a dirigible.
A dirigible, exactly, a helium-filled dirigible, and that was the proposal that Williams engineer Stephen Barclay up in Alberta had proposed, was this type of an airship, because which can stay up in the air. In fact, some of these can stay up almost indefinitely.
Yeah.
It can be power driven, electric driven, but with a rechargeable battery, and you just you leave them up there in the air all the time.
Yeah.
Park them up there when you're not using them, but that's what we're looking at. And I just was on the phone, in fact, with William. We've been kind of out of touch since the project has kind of unraveled in the face of lack of funding. But I'm working on that, a different angle, which I'm maybe in a couple months I can share some more interesting things with you.
That would be great.
That'd be nice.
If it all develops as anticipated. But the point was, he's been talking with some other companies, some other blimp companies, and the technologies are changing daily. And the type of strategy that he had envisioned 5 years ago, now, and which at a cost of $500,000 for the first year of operation for equipment and operating costs, manpower and everything else, now could be done for probably under $100,000.
Right.
So, or less even. Just the equipment alone in the neighborhood of probably 20,000 to 30,000 or something in that ballpark.
And it's amazing to even hear those kind of numbers, because I wouldn't have any idea what what to expect from the cost level for such an outfit to have to take place. So when you throw those numbers out, I was pretty stunned. I didn't think it would have to be that much.
Yeah, pocket change, right?
Well,
right. Well, that was the thing. It was admittedly a very ambitious project, but at the time it was proposed, that was the best way to get at it. I mean, you just saying you're going to do it with a multi-copter was the same as people in the past waving tranquilizer guns around, saying they were going to tranquilize the Sasquatch.
Right.
It was just either ignorant or disingenuous,
right.
Because it just wasn't. You can't do anything in 20 minutes. It takes you 8 minutes to get the thing launched and into the area. And it has a range of less than a mile. You can only go line of sight in the daytime, and so you might as well walk.
Right.
Right.
You'd probably have a better job, more thorough job walking it than you would flying over it with this thing. So the Aurora, as it was dubbed, this airship was really the only logical alternative, but at nearly $300,000 when she had it equipped properly. The sticker shock was took everyone back. And
my sticker shock is working right now too. Wow.
Yeah. And people just kind of and so it floundered and it languished, and then there were some prospects of some benefactors that then the recession hit, and those individuals were impacted, but now. I mean, like I said, as of this afternoon, I just, by coincidence, had a call out of the blue from William, and just to kind of catch up with things, and he had been on the phone with two different companies, one back east and one in California, that do blimps, these helium-filled blimps, and the prices he was quoting. I mean, I was stunned in the opposite direction. I couldn't believe how attainable they were.
Well, that's good.
That is great.
That's got to be the line of approach in the future. I think in order to get at this, it's really the only way that we're going to find that moving needle in the hay.
Yeah, I would totally agree, and that makes the best sense to have that, especially if it's something that can be sustainable in the air. But we're kind of running towards the end of the show now, so I kind of wanted to give you an opportunity to plug anything that you wanted to, ways for folks to get in touch with you, or follow your research and buy your book, things like that.
Right. Well, yeah, I recommend the book as a good starting point. There are a lot of other titles that would be good to have on your shelf as well. Dr. Bindernagel's books and Chris Murphy's books, Robert Alley's book. There's a number of them. But I'm often surprised when people still email me and they'll ask questions and I'll very politely, because I just don't have time to write out a lengthy answer to these as much as I'd like to, and I'll say, well, have you read my book? Oh, you have a book? So for all you aspiring Bigfoot enthusiasts, you citizen scientists, that should be Bigfoot 101, and then you can graduate on to those other authors.
Yeah.
Also, in the vein of the citizen scientist, I'll plug my Sasquatch field guide, which has been very popular and very successful in reaching out to the amateur investigator and giving them a little bit of ammunition to help them, a few arrows to put in their quiver, in a very accessible, very portable package.
And durable, too. I own both your book and that, and I keep that in my my casting bag. So.
Good. And it's on the checkout stand at every REI across the country, which is a nice endorsement too. I'm in the final stages of production of a second field guide.
Excellent. Which
actually will be kind of a shrunken head of my next book. I'm on sabbatical this year, and one of my primary, in addition to sneaking off and doing field work, my principal objectives is writing the next book, which the working title is something along the lines of Sasquatch and Other Wild Men, The Search for Relic Hominoids. And it will put Sasquatch, and these other forms like the orang pendek or the ibugogo, the Himalayan yeti, the Russian almas, each of these different forms within a context, a broader context, along with Sasquatch, that these may be relic species of hominoids or hominins, human ancestors, more direct human ancestors, like the almas, maybe a relic Neanderthal or a relic Denisovan, as the possible candidates multiply with each successive discovery. And so that's going to be the next effort. And in my attempts to create a context, this one will actually be a little headier. I'm still making it accessible to a general audience, but it will be, repletely cited and with references and annotations, and figures, so that it will also, hold its own within the scientific circles as well, and be a kind of a rallying point for those of this upcoming generation of anthropologists. That's another thing too, talking about paradigm shifts. When I do go to the meetings, a lot of the young scholars come up and very discreetly discuss their interests in what I'm doing. And any developments and so forth. And so
well, I know we're very much enwrapped into your work as well. And who knows, maybe someday our paths will cross. We'll get an opportunity to research side by side too. I'm always looking for a reason to get back to Idaho.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to thank you very, very much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule and sitting down and chatting with Nicole and I here on ASIP Radio. And it's been hugely informative and an absolute delight. And just, again, thank you so much for being on the show.
Sure. It's been my pleasure. It's always fun. Doesn't take a whole lot to get the stone rolling down the hill and get me talking.
Hey, and that's great. That's awesome. Well, thank you very much, and you
Thank
have a
you.
great night, and we'll hopefully talk to you here in the near future.
Okay, good. I hope I'll have some impressive developments.
Yes, fingers
to share.
crossed.
I'm sure you will. All right, have a good night, Jeff.
All right,
Good
you
night.
too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, that was extremely fascinating.
Yeah.
How was it for you, honey?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that all you have to say?
Yeah. Yeah, that was, yeah. I love that man.
He is a phenomenal speaker. I have to, even if he wasn't speaking about this topic, and which is fascinating, just listening to the man talk.
He's
so
think
eloquent.
This is going to be the quietest episode on our end.
I know.
To date.
I'm like, just let the man talk.
Oh, it was awesome. I mean, it was so well articulated.
Right. There were so many times I wanted to be like, thank you, sir. Your grammar was impeccable.
Yeah.
It melted my heart.
Yeah.
But yes, he was amazing.
He is such a nice guy, too. Very personable, just down to earth.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, he's just a walking wealth of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the coverage of just things and I don't know if people are going to get this, but when you listen to him talk, the things he has to know to be able to have said the things that he did and tie it all together, obviously, knowledgeably, that's a lot of knowledge.
Yes, he's put in a
Now,
lot
mind
of
you,
time
he
and
is
effort.
Yeah.
You can tell.
Of course, yeah, he definitely has put in his hours at the library, as he was talking about. And I wanted to say, oh yeah, the Dewey Decimal
System. Yes, I love the Dewey Decimal System.
But the biggest thing was just hearing how all those years, I guess, of him studying and researching, especially being a professor of anatomy and anthropology and certain studies of primates and morphology?
Yeah.
Yeah, so all of those things coming together outside of even that was this other layer that kind of encapsulated it of all these other studies and knowledge pieces that he's put together to make his research that much more credible, solid, and just well-founded, really.
And I just love how it turned out. It started as this high school project that he had to do, and it turned into his life's work. So you hear that, kids. Stay in school. Because you're going to get that one project that's just going to change your life.
Stay in school. Don't be a fool.
Try
to be cool like Jeff Meldrum.
Fool?
I didn't have anything on that, but whatever. You get the point. Stay in school.
Yes.
Well, yeah, we're really busy this month, but looking forward to just all of the adventures that this month is going to give us, and I don't know what else to say. We're bursting at the seams with so much that's going on, and right now I'm completely enlightened by that conversation. So
yes, that was a great one. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you for taking time out of your evening to spend it with us and deal with our ramblings. And best of luck that everything turns out and you get your funding that you need.
Yeah,
because that would be amazing.
Would be. All right, well, I say we just run it on out. We ride out on the sunset on this one. This is going to literally be a 2-hour show.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a nice special. So thank you, folks, for hanging in there with us.
It's a big special for a big topic.
Big keyword. All right, have a great night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
What an excellent day for an exorcism.
There are people who have reported experiencing the same things that we have been experiencing.
hear the brush popping and stuff. Oh, there he goes. Jesus.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.